The evening sky over Crestwood Meadows was painted in shades of pink and gold as families wound down their Sunday routines. Children pedaled their bikes lazily around the cul-de-sacs, sprinklers ticked across neatly trimmed lawns, and the neighborhood carried its usual air of calm predictability. For years, Crestwood Meadows had been known as one of the safest, most pristine communities in the county, the kind of place where neighbors waved when passing and people boasted about property values steadily climbing. No one could have guessed that the order of things was about to collapse. Just after sunset, the air changed. The wind picked up sharply, snapping through tree branches, and a strange greenish tint spread across the clouds. Phones buzzed in unison with the same severe weather alert. A hailstorm was approaching and residents were advised to seek shelter immediately. Before most people could process the warning, the first pellets of ice began to fall, light at first, then quickly growing larger, harder, faster. Within minutes, the neighborhood was under siege. Hailstones the size of golf balls pummeled rooftops and cars, smashing windows, denting garage doors, stripping paint from fences. The sound was deafening, as if an army of hammers was raining down from the sky. Families huddled together in basements or bathrooms, listening to the furious pounding above them. Children cried, dogs barked, parents whispered prayers that their homes would hold. For nearly an hour, Crestwood Meadows was battered relentlessly until the storm finally passed, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. When residents emerged, they found their once immaculate streets transformed into a disaster zone. Lawns were littered with shattered branches, flower beds were buried under ice, cars were dimpled and glass strewn. Even worse, rooftops bore scars, shingles ripped away, gutters mangled, siding cracked. Crestwood Meadows had survived storms before, but never anything like this. The neighborhood that had always looked picture-perfect now resembled a battlefield. 2 days later, when people were still cleaning debris and calling insurance companies, an email from the HOA landed in every inbox. Its subject line was urgent, almost ominous: community-wide repair assessment, immediate action required. The message was signed by the HOA president, Martin Graves, a man who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. He explained that after a rapid inspection, the board had determined that catastrophic damage required urgent, large-scale repairs to the roofs, siding, and shared structures. Insurance would not cover enough and reserves were insufficient. Therefore, every household was being charged a special assessment of $20,000, due in full within 90 days. The number sent shockwaves through the community. $20,000 per household wasn't just a repair bill, it was a financial bomb. Sarah Thompson, a nurse and single mother of 2, read the email 3 times in disbelief. She already worked double shifts to pay her mortgage and daycare fees. Where was she supposed to find that kind of money? Across the street, retirees Mark and Linda Alvarez sat at their kitchen table, staring at the printed letter. They had lived in Crestwood Meadows for over 2 decades, paying their dues faithfully. "What the hell have they been doing with all that money?" Mark muttered, slamming his fist down. "We trusted them, and now this?" Within hours, phones buzzed and neighbors knocked on each other's doors. Panic spread quickly, followed by anger. Some thought it had to be a mistake, others wondered if the HOA was exploiting the crisis. Conversations that night stretched late into the evening, frustration building with each retelling of the HOA's demand. 3 days later, the HOA called an emergency meeting at the community center. The room was packed with residents, every chair taken, people pressed against the walls, their faces tight with worry. At the front sat the board, Martin Graves, tall and silver-haired with his usual calm expression, Vice President Janet Cole tapping her pen impatiently, and Treasurer Daniel Wu, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Martin tapped the microphone and began to speak. His voice was measured, almost soothing. He acknowledged the storm's devastation and confirmed the special assessment of $20,000 per household. He framed it as unfortunate but necessary, a sacrifice the community had to make together. The crowd erupted almost instantly. People shouted from the back rows, demanding to know why the reserves were empty. "My insurance already covers my roof, why should I pay for everyone else?" someone yelled. Sarah stood and raised her voice, trembling but determined. "Most of us don't have that kind of money. You're asking us to choose between our homes and bankruptcy." Martin tried to calm the uproar, insisting the board had acted in the best interest of everyone, but the residents weren't convinced. They demanded details, receipts, transparency. Martin deflected, repeating that the decision was final. When the meeting ended, the air outside the community center buzzed with outrage. Neighbors huddled in small groups, whispering furiously. "Where did all the money go?" Linda Alvarez asked bitterly. "We've been paying dues for years. What happened to the reserves?" Jake Miller, a young resident who worked in data analysis, shook his head. "Either they mismanaged the funds or they're hiding something. It doesn't add up." Sarah, overhearing, stepped closer. "We can't just roll over and accept this. If we don't push back, they'll keep taking advantage of us. That night, a new chat group formed on everyone's phones, Crestwood United. Within hours, dozens joined. By the next day, there were hundreds. People shared screenshots, rumors, suspicions. Some pointed out that Martin had approved expensive landscaping projects recently and renovations to the clubhouse that seemed unnecessary. Others wondered if the HOA had been draining the reserves for years. The more they talked, the angrier they became, and slowly an idea began to form. Maybe the $20,000 assessment wasn't about storm repairs at all. Maybe it was about covering mistakes, or worse, covering something the board didn't want them to see. By the end of that week, Crestwood Meadows was no longer the quiet, orderly neighborhood it had been. It was a community divided, frightened, and preparing for battle. The neighborhood no longer felt like Crestwood Meadows. Instead of quiet lawns and friendly waves, there were hushed conversations at mailboxes, tense gatherings in garages, and constant chatter in the Crestwood United group chat. The storm had shaken their homes, but the HOA's announcement had shaken their trust even more. Sarah Thompson hadn't meant to become a leader, but her voice carried through the uncertainty. She was the one who kept saying what everyone else was afraid to, that the HOA's demand wasn't just harsh, it was suspicious. With help from Mark and Linda Alvarez, she began circulating a petition for an independent audit of the HOA's finances. To her surprise, signatures poured in. Neighbors who rarely spoke now knocked on her door to add their names. Within 3 days, over 70 households had signed. By the end of the week, nearly 120 had. It was almost the entire community, united in defiance. When Sarah and Jake Miller, the young data analyst from 2 blocks over, marched into the HOA office with the stack of papers, Martin Graves didn't even look impressed. He read the first page, then slid the document back across the desk with a faint smile that looked more like mockery. "This is not how things work," he said coolly. "The board has authority, we are acting within our rights. This," he tapped the petition, "means nothing." Sarah's cheeks flushed hot. "It means everything to the people you're supposed to represent. Ignore it and we'll take this higher, we'll find a way." Martin's smile disappeared and his eyes hardened. "Be careful what you threaten, Ms. Thompson." That night, Jake spread papers across Sarah's kitchen table, his laptop glowing blue against the stacks of numbers. "Look at this," he said, pointing to columns of expenses from the HOA's last annual report. Tens of thousands labeled as landscaping improvements, but there's no detail, no invoices, nothing to show what was done. Linda Alvarez leaned over the table, frowning. $45,000 for clubhouse renovations. They barely replaced the carpet last year. Where did the rest of the money go? The deeper they looked, the more irregularities they found. Payments to companies no one had ever heard of. Vague categories like administrative fees with 5-figure totals, consulting costs that didn't make sense for a small suburban HOA. Screenshots flew around the Crestwood United chat, circled in red with captions like, "Does anyone know this contractor? And this has to be fraud." The rumors grew faster than facts. Some residents said Martin was pocketing money. Others whispered that Janet Cole's brother owned one of the landscaping companies paid by the HOA. No one could prove it, but the trust between the board and the residents had already collapsed. The HOA's response came swiftly. Official letters began arriving in mailboxes, printed on heavy paper with the HOA's logo at the top. The message was cold and threatening. Any household that failed to pay the $20,000 assessment within 90 days could face liens, late fees, and even foreclosure proceedings. Some residents panicked, their voices trembling as they asked what would happen if they resisted. A few scraped together the money, paying out of fear, but most refused. The more the board pushed, the more determined the others became. One humid evening, Sarah's garage filled with neighbors. Folding chairs were crammed between bikes and storage boxes, fans whirred overhead, and the air buzzed with nervous energy. Mark Alvarez stood up first, his voice steady but fierce. "We've been paying dues faithfully for years. What they're demanding now isn't just unfair, it's criminal. If we give in, they'll keep bleeding us dry." From the back of the garage, a young mother holding her baby spoke hesitantly. "But what if they really do foreclose? I can't lose my home, I don't have anywhere else to go." Sarah rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice rang clear. "That's exactly what they want us to believe. Fear is their weapon. But here's the truth, they can't push all of us out. They don't have the power they pretend to. The law protects us if we're willing to fight, we just have to stand together." Her words seemed to ripple through the crowd, heads nodded and murmurs of agreement filled the space. For the first time since the storm, hope sparked among them. By the time the third HOA meeting came, the residents were no longer scattered voices of frustration. They were organized, angry, and ready. Dozens arrived carrying binders and folders, evidence of financial inconsistencies. The Crestwood United Group had transformed into a movement, and they were prepared to confront the board face to face. The community center was overflowing by the time the third meeting began. Chairs filled every corner, people lined the walls, and the hallway outside buzzed with voices straining to hear. This time, residents hadn't come empty-handed. They carried stacks of papers, binders stuffed with printouts, even poster boards with charts and numbers. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was evidence. At the front, the board looked uneasy. Martin Graves sat stiffly, his silver hair neatly combed, but there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. Janet Cole tapped her pen against her notebook, eyes darting between the crowd and the exit. Daniel Wu stared at the table, avoiding everyone's gaze. Martin cleared his throat and began in his usual calm tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. I know emotions are high, but we must remain civil. The special assessment of $20,000 remains in place. It is necessary for the survival of our community." The words barely left his mouth before Sarah Thompson stood. Her binder thudded onto the table in front of her, pages spilling open. "We're done listening to empty explanations. We want transparency. Where did the reserves go? Why are there thousands spent on consulting fees and landscaping with no documentation? We demand a full independent audit before a single dollar is collected." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound bouncing off the walls. Mark Alvarez raised his voice above the noise. "And if you refuse, we'll take this to court. We will not pay a dime until you show us where our money went." Martin slammed his palm on the table. "This board has acted within its legal rights. You are bound by the association's covenants. If you do not comply, you risk liens and foreclosure. That is the law." Boos filled the room. Someone shouted, "You're lying." Another voice called, "We'll recall you." Jake Miller, holding up a printed chart, stepped into the aisle. "I've reviewed every financial report you've filed in the last 3 years. Do you know what I found? Payments to companies that don't exist. Renovation costs that don't match the work done. This isn't just mismanagement, it looks like fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Martin's face flushed red, his composure cracking. "You have no authority to make accusations like that." Sarah's voice rang out again, strong and steady. "Maybe not here, but a judge will listen, and so will the county auditor. We're not afraid of your threats anymore." The residents roared in agreement, stomping their feet, clapping, shouting over one another. For the first time, the board looked cornered. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Martin tried to call for order, but his voice was drowned out. Janet snapped her notebook shut and whispered something sharply to Daniel, who still wouldn't raise his head. The residents surged closer to the front, their voices no longer asking but demanding: audit, recall, accountability. When the crowd finally spilled into the night, the air was electric. People hugged, shook hands, and spoke with renewed determination. What had started as fear was now defiance. Crestwood Meadows had reached a breaking point, and the battle lines were clear. The HOA still held legal authority on paper, but the residents had found their power in numbers. And deep down, everyone knew this wasn't going to end with a simple meeting. The fight had only just begun. Word of the chaotic meeting spread beyond Crestwood Meadows within days. Local news outlets picked up the story after a resident posted video clips online showing residents shouting "audit, audit, audit" while the board tried to silence them. The clip went viral in the county Facebook groups, and suddenly Crestwood Meadows became a symbol of homeowners standing up against HOA abuse. Reporters called for interviews, and residents who once felt powerless found their voices amplified. The pressure mounted quickly. Sarah Thompson, Mark and Linda Alvarez, and Jake Miller organized a formal complaint to the county auditor's office, attaching every questionable financial record they had uncovered. Within a week, the county announced it would conduct a preliminary investigation into the HOA's finances. When the notice arrived, Martin Graves tried to downplay it. He sent another email to residents insisting the board was innocent and accusing a small group of agitators of spreading lies. But no one believed him anymore. Even those who had paid the assessment were demanding refunds. The Crestwood United Group was now nearly unanimous in its goal: remove the board and reclaim control. The decisive moment came at a special recall meeting forced by the residents after they gathered enough signatures under the HOA bylaws. The community center overflowed once again, but this time the energy was different. It wasn't just anger, it was resolve. Residents stood in line, signed their ballots, and one by one voted to remove the existing board. When the results were announced, cheers shook the walls. Martin Graves, Janet Cole, and Daniel Wu were officially recalled. Sarah Thompson's knees went weak with relief, tears welling in her eyes as neighbors hugged her and patted her back. For the first time since the storm, the community felt united. But the story wasn't over. The county auditor's report arrived a month later, confirming what many suspected: years of mismanagement, inflated contracts, and payments to shell companies connected to board members. Nearly $200,000 had been siphoned away from HOA funds under the guise of maintenance and renovations. The $20,000 storm assessment had been their desperate attempt to cover the shortfall before anyone noticed. The county referred the case to the district attorney's office. Criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement followed. When the news broke, Crestwood Meadows erupted again, this time in vindication. The very board that had threatened residents with foreclosure was now facing prison. In the months that followed, a new HOA board was elected, made up of residents who had fought the hardest. Mark Alvarez as president, Jake Miller as treasurer, and two other longtime neighbors as directors. Sarah refused an official role, saying she wanted to focus on her children and her work, but everyone knew she had been the heart of the fight. At the first meeting under the new board, Mark publicly thanked her, calling her the voice that gave us courage when we needed it most. Repairs in Crestwood Meadows didn't happen overnight. Insurance claims were still tangled and money had to be carefully managed. But now every expenditure was posted openly online. Residents attended meetings with confidence instead of dread. What had once been a neighborhood divided by fear was slowly rebuilt, not just in shingles and siding, but in trust. On a crisp fall evening nearly 6 months after the storm, Sarah stood on her porch watching her kids ride their bikes again, laughter echoing down the street. The lawns were green, the roofs repaired, and the neighbors waved warmly as they passed. Crestwood Meadows wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was theirs again. And this time no one could take that from them. The hailstorm had cracked their homes, but the real damage had come from within, from those entrusted with power. By standing together, the residents had discovered that unity was stronger than fear, and that sometimes the greatest repairs aren't made to buildings but to people learning to fight for one another.